to engage with yourself and with others, and the importance of that. And our guest this morning is Molly Barari. Hello, Molly.
Hello.
And let's start off, Molly, by getting the audience familiar with Molly. Who is Molly really?
Wow, it's so deep. It's such a deep question. Hello, everyone. I'm Molly Barari, and I've been a South Dakota Humanities Scholar since 2016. And I absolutely love all the work that I get to do through the Humanities Council. So thank you for having me here today. I moved to Rapid City, South Dakota in 2008 from Kearney, Nebraska. And that's actually when I met Todd Williams. I started working for the Rapid City Journal. They were doing a project where we were starting community blogs. And that's where I got my start here in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And I had been wanting to move to the Black Hills for quite some time. So I was very excited that Todd and his team gave me a chance at the Rapid City Journal, and that got me up here in the Black Hills. And since then, I have been doing a variety of jobs. Currently, though, I am teaching writing classes through the Humanities Council and also through community education of the Black Hills. And I just finished my doctorate with University of South Dakota last summer. And my doctorate is in adult education. I also have an MFA in creative writing. So I have had an educational journey. I have been teaching writing classes. And I also do work for the Blood Donation Center here in Rapid City. That's my other job. So I'm out there recruiting blood donors and helping people understand the importance of blood donation. So I stay very busy and active between all of my different jobs and pursuits.
Mm-hmm. So that brings to mind a question. Which is it harder to do, to get people to tell their story or to give you blood?
Oh, it's definitely harder to get people to give blood. I think that needles are a huge fear for people. And that's why they hire people like me to go out and to get people to sign up to give blood. And it's very important because we actually have a nationwide blood shortage. So I could go on and on about that topic all day, but well, it's very hard.
We'll schedule that for another time, yes, because I think that is a very important conversation to have and to brainstorm about, is the state of blood, in the country.
It is. Yeah. It's not something that people think about every day, but actually helping people to share their life stories, that's what I'm passionate about. And that's why I'm here today.
Yes.
I teach life story writing workshops, and I teach those through the Humanities Council. So I'm out there in communities all across the Black Hills, leading these life story writing workshops. So if you've ever read a memoir, which just give a quick raise of hands if you've ever read a memoir or listened to a memoir on audiobook, quick raise of hands. Okay.
Okay.
Yes. So basically, if you're trying to write your life stories, you are working on your memoirs. It's the same endeavor. And in my life story writing workshops, we practice techniques for writing your life stories. The only difference is most of the people who take the workshops are not writing a memoir. They're not writing their entire autobiography. So instead, we are working on writing shorter stories from your life, not your entire life story.
So in that approach to doing it, do you find that people can kind of wrap their heads around their story more if they take it in small chunks? And if so, do they ever put it back together, and what does that feel like?
Yes, I do think that it's helpful for people to imagine writing one story from their life versus maybe a 200-page book, from the time they're born to the time where they're at now. So if you are working on writing your life stories, you can really start anywhere. You might write the story of your wedding day and put that in a life story notebook full of stories from your life. Or you might start with the story of how you traveled to the Middle East for the first time and the experiences that you had there. Maybe Todd could write that story. So you could really work on a shorter story from your life and then put that in a compilation, like a notebook or a folder of several stories from your life, and then organize those later into some kind of chronological order. And I think that a lot of people who start writing just anywhere, they start writing a story that they're passionate about, then they do keep writing and they do try to connect those dots and they do try to work on longer stories. It's starting somewhere and then starting to piece those stories together later. You're right, Lawrence. They do end up piecing them together.
It sounds often like it's a quilt, almost a quilting kind of exercise where you work on a square at a time, and then based on maybe if you're starting to write the whole memoir, maybe you have a whole quilt design in mind, but then otherwise you can do these short squares, and then after you have the squares you can say, well, how would this fit together best? Does that describe
Exactly.
it?
Sometimes people just start with a 1 or 2 page story, maybe even about an event that inspired them, such as the first time they saw a work of art that truly left them feeling awestruck. So it might just be a story on a very specific topic that becomes a 1 or 2 page story. And then later, if they start working on a longer autobiography, that scene could fit in somewhere into that patchwork. So it really is great to go through those creative exercises and to write where your heart leads you that day. And then maybe later on, figure out where that might fit into your memoir.
Many times a story, whether it's a full chronological story or a piece, as we're talking about now, can take place from different perspectives, you know, and I think you've probably seen or read some kind of stories that people tell in that way, like you might tell the same story from different characters' perspectives, but you also might, in telling your own story, tell it from different perspectives. For example, it might be just a factual chronological perspective. It might be from an emotional perspective. It might be from a relationship perspective. Can you talk to us a little bit about the different approaches that people use to tell their stories?
Absolutely. We actually do quite a bit of work on point of view and perspective in my life story writing workshops, because I think it's so powerful to practice writing your story in different ways and maybe, reimagine it as if it's told from your mother's point of view rather than your own, and maybe try to put yourself in her shoes and what she was thinking and feeling during this event that you're writing about. So we often try to get into the hearts and souls of other characters in your story when we're working on our pieces of writing. And sometimes we also try to imagine different ways to talk about ourselves. So rather than writing from the first person perspective, such as I did this and I felt this way, maybe try writing your story with she. She felt this, she felt this way. It really does add some dimension and lets you explore different emotions when you try it from a different perspective.
I tend to go for the third person myself, you know. We.
Okay. Yeah.
The royal we.
So, as soon as you start playing with perspectives, do you think you're going to have the same story as
No,
you started with?
no.
Absolutely not. I mean, the story takes on different shapes and forms, and it's a fun exercise to try to write the same exact story, but just with a different point of view.
I want to invite our audience to join this conversation because it really is about you. And I'm sure that all of you have a story because it's kind of not possible not to. And I'd like to explore how you might be able to tell that story and the importance of telling your story. So Molly, give us a little start here about why it's important to tell our story.
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to correct you, Lawrence. So people don't just have one story. And I think that is a common misconception. People will say, everyone has a story. Well, I like to say everyone has stories, right? It's not just the one story. And I think that's where people kind of get in their heads, like, I have to tell my story. Just tell a story from your life. That's all you have to do.
And I notice all my personalities have a story and they all want to tell the
That's
story at the
right.
same time.
Same here. Same here. So just start with a story that's meaningful to you. It could be a life milestone that you lived through, like an important accomplishment or achievement in your life. Or it could be just a simple moment in time that was meaningful, such as cooking with your grandmother on a Sunday. And you want to bring that story back to life because it meant something to you when you were a child. So I like to say you can either think big or think small, but usually when you try to focus yourself in to the moment in time that you're remembering, the more focused you can get on that memory, the better the story will be. And your goal is to try to bring it back to life again through your words, through sensory detail. You're reliving that experience and bringing it back to life by, telling people what you saw in that moment, telling people what you smelled, what you heard with your ears, really including those sensory details. Think back to the 5 senses that you learned about in grade school and try to incorporate those into your writing. Even if you're writing a page, you can make it full of sensory detail.
I want to get back to that, but before we leave this subject, I would like to explore why it's important. What are the benefits of telling a story, our story?
Yes, I think it's important to think about that. Why am I even doing this? Why am I interested in writing my stories? Is it even important? Will anyone even care? And those are all good questions. With my dissertation that I worked on for USD, I did a qualitative study on the reasons that people actually engage in life story writing. And I found out that the top reasons that they actually want to write their stories, there's actually 4 different categories of reasons. And the first one is that they're interested in the social aspect and the sharing aspect of writing their life stories. So if they're coming to a life story writing workshop, they want to hear from other people who are engaged in that same process, and they want to hear those other stories. So the sharing of those stories is incredibly important to feel like you can relate to someone else's life experiences. Another big reason is they want to leave their legacy. So they're leaving their life stories for family and friends who will read their stories, hopefully, later. And leaving that legacy and a piece of themselves and their lives is a reason that they want to write. Another reason is for people who are really just into writing, they want to improve the craft of writing. They want to come and work on their life stories so they can just become better writers and learn different techniques for telling a story better. And then the final reason that people write is that they want that therapeutic release of telling their life stories and maybe experiencing that situation again, so they can come to terms with something that was in their past. And that emotional release of writing and reliving actually has a therapeutic effect for many people. So all those are reasons why people write, and maybe why you should start writing your life story.
I would like to add one more perspective on, in addition to the things that you've brought up, Molly, is it helped me to clarify and think deeper about events in my life. I say that because the memory, we often think of memory as something that is like a tape recorder that you just sort of play back and forth to arrive at the story. But actually, the way that memory works is that you assemble, remember, or reassemble events like bits and pieces and create a new story every time you think of the story. And so what I found was useful in writing is that it put something down and gave it parameters, and then I could fill it in and just say, well, did that happen? Did it happen like that? Or, oh yeah, I wonder what they were thinking then. Or why did I actually do that? Because some of those bits and pieces, they get lost like film on the floor and never to be found again. And then sometimes when I would bring back those memories, it clarified the connection between all of the things, all of those ongoing events. The connection between all those ongoing events had long since dissipated. But now by trying to reassemble them like the big quilt, now things started to make a lot more sense of why I was
right. I think you're right. It helps you make meaning, right? It helps you make meaning of some of those events that happened. I think that's what you're saying. It's making meaning and kind of clarifying what did happen in a way that your brain can make sense of it.
Yes. I would like to throw it out to our esteemed panel. And do you guys have any particular memories that you think now that you have written down, or you are thinking now, maybe I should write something down about that?
Even if it's a 1 or 2 page story that you're thinking that you could write about a specific memory. Does anyone have anything that you're thinking of today?
I'd like to throw some things out before I forget them. You have hit every button on my list of why I want to write and why I do write haphazardly, sporadically, on a variety of things. And somehow this pandemic has brought me to a point where I am experiencing things more than I gave myself time to. So every reason and these approaches that you've laid out, it's just what I need to hear right now. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Betty. Do you have anything that you're thinking of specifically writing about, Betty?
Well, just this week I've written 2, I guess you could call them essays. I'm not sure what that form requires, but and published them on Facebook because I kind of live on Facebook, especially since, well, I do. So my mother gave birth to me, surprisingly, on Mother's Day morning in 1944, when she already had 2 children. It wasn't like she didn't know what was going on, but I must have been wanting to get out early. So that's been a backdrop. And my aunt, who was there at the time, used to cut my hair sometimes when I was a kid, and she would always have to tell me why I had this bump on my head. It's because my mother dropped me out on the bathroom floor. So, I mean, this has been just kind of one of those crazy things, but a few days ago, I decided I was going to post this photo of my mother holding me as a baby in front of the house where I was born and my two older siblings assembled. So I elaborated a little bit, and then she had written a little story, and it got published in the American News years ago when they had a Mother's Day thing going on. So anyway, I did a better job of writing it, and it got a lot of attention, and people saw things in there that they related to. And then this morning, I wrote a little thing posting a photo of myself when I was in the hospital yesterday waiting for a minor, no, not minor surgery. You know, so I'm sitting there in my gown, and my niece took a photo of me with the mask on and my IV in and all that. And so then as I posted, I thought, well, what am I going to say about this? I didn't want people to say, oh my God, are you sick? Oh, what's wrong? Don't die now. It's almost your birthday. But instead, I used that opportunity to express my experience of a multitude of jobs. Eventually, I got a job that paid my health care. And then I went to another situation. And then I got to be old enough for Medicare. And that threw the gates open to where I can now have good health care. And I think a lot of us, when we reach 70, we start kind of paying more attention because we can afford to go to a doctor. So then I started taking care of myself better, things I knew I should do. And now I had time and impetus with a very good group of care providers. So that's what I've been doing this week with writing. Just it's been interesting to see how it comes out of me and how people respond. And this piles in on a bunch of family research and history and paintings I've done from old family photos. And so this is just wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, I'm no shortage in me. Sometimes you have to just shut me off.
No, that's all good stuff, Betty. Thank you for sharing that. You know, and you bring up another important point, I think, in expressing who we are, is we can do something other than words too. And I like the fact that you brought up paintings, because a lot of what we know about people are from paintings and photographs and things like that. So there are things such as image essays, you know, and there, as they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So, you know, it's sometimes hard to get 1,000 words on one page, you know.
I like the fact that Betty brought up photographs as well, because photographs can be inspiring when you're sitting down to write some of your life stories. Maybe find a photograph that depicts a meaningful memory or moment for you.
Yeah.
And then make it your challenge to take that photograph and to paint those characters through your words, to actually bring those characters to your page when you're writing, to bring that moment back to your page through your words. So you can use a photograph to help you get started if you're struggling for where to begin.
I'm just afraid I'm going to end before I get a really good beginning, because I'm getting pretty darn old. I just want to throw in a funny thing that my first husband said. He was not a writer. He said in this kind of conversation, he said, well, pictures speak worder than loud.
I like that. Very wise.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any stories they're contemplating putting down onto paper?
Yeah, I do. This is James Stengel. Molly, I took a class from you last year on obituaries through the extension.
Yes. I remember you. Welcome, James.
Thank you. And I'm a caregiver for my mother. She turns 99 next Thursday. And she can no longer communicate very well. And I just using some of her stories that I recall as I work on that obituary. It's unknown when it's going to be needed, but it helps me get through the day, and it puts me a little bit ahead when the time does come. But I want to thank you for Molly. That was a very interesting class you put on last year sometime. I don't recall when it was, but a Zoom class, and it really sparked some interest in documenting some things and realizing that, hey, get some things down on writing, even if it's just that you may need in the future for some other projects. So thank you very much.
Thanks, James.
Yeah.
I appreciate you sharing. Looks like we have a comment from Facebook from Deb, who says, I was the first non-prior servicewoman to join the South Dakota National Guard. There's an NG museum in the state, and I think I should write something about my experiences to add to the history of the state.
I
Definitely.
Would ditto that. Yes.
We all agree. You should do that, Deb.
Yeah, we'll be looking for it next week.
Yes.
Well, one of the things that brings up is a lot of special experiences that we have, each of us have, that we can take for granted or just never get around to writing about. But it's amazing how many of those letters or short stories, or in the case of some of my friends, poetry, we have had in our poetry group, people have taken out in significant events in their lives and written poems, sometimes relatively short poems, maybe 20 lines or 30 lines, but in that poem, they have described a scene that without that poem, we might have missed some particular piece of equipment or some particular event or some particular relationship that when we read it, it helps clarify our own because it brings back some memory. And maybe it's not the same thing, but it reminds us to think about something. So I say all of that to say all of our experiences are important, not just to us, but to others.
I think that's why the sharing aspect of life story writing is so important, and why people have, indicated even through my dissertation that sharing and socializing was so important. It's because, like you said, Lawrence, they're really learning from other people's stories and experiences, and it makes them even see their own lives in a new light, in a new perspective. And during the pandemic is when I completed my dissertation. So I think you're also seeing that through the lens of the pandemic and how socializing and sharing became more important, even through a writing workshop, which is, you would think writing is a solitary endeavor, but during the pandemic, people were searching for that connection. And we were able to provide that through the life story writing workshops on Zoom.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else have some story that they have told or written or are writing or feel they should write? Something
Yes.
yeah.
Anyone else have any stories they are thinking of writing or they're working on right now? Or do you just want to share it with us today because it's coming to your head and it's a great story
Mm-hmm.
from your life?
Deb says, starting with a photo, and she says she has a lot of them, to begin with the flow of thoughts is a great idea. Yeah. Or to begin a flow of thoughts. That was something you mentioned earlier, Molly, that and a lot of those make great prompts. I agree.
Well, and when you're working with a photograph, you can really see details that you may not have seen otherwise, because in a photograph, normally you have people, you have a setting, like a background of some kind. You have some kind of action going on, perhaps. So you can really try to focus in on what did the setting look like? Can I bring some of those hues of the sky or the ocean or the grass or even the porch swing? Can I talk about what it looked like? Or can I bring that photo to the forefront when I'm trying to write? Or can I talk about how those people looked and what their voices sounded like? Can I imagine being back there in that photograph and in that moment? It's really about picturing yourself back in that memory, back in that moment in time, and then trying to translate it onto your paper. And a lot of people say, well, how am I supposed to remember? Or what if I don't remember exactly? You know, what if I don't remember exactly? Is that okay? If I don't remember exactly how it happened, or maybe they said something to the effect of this and not that, is that okay if I make up some of the dialogue? And I say, you can make it to the best of your memory, but it's still a creative pursuit. It's still creative nonfiction. So yes, you can put some dialogue in there between people to the best of your memory. That's okay, because we're still working with creative nonfiction. And also the story is being written from, like we've talked about, Lawrence, your perspective, and you own your story. So you can write it to the best of your memory. You can't ever write it, you know, based on what someone else's memory is, because you don't have it. Mm-hmm. So it really is your story to own.
And I think it's important. I think it's also important to acknowledge the fragile fragility of our own memories. You know, sometimes we give ourselves too much responsibility for memory that just physically can't happen. You know, the neurons don't work that way. So there are a lot of things that, you know, the brain washes out stuff every time you go to sleep. That's part of the point of sleeping. As far as I know, the research is still showing that part of the reason for sleeping is to wash out minutia. And sometimes it's that minutia that makes the other things that's left make sense. And so there are some things that exist in the photograph that you never would have pulled out, you know, or you might have thought that people always, let's say, button their suits to the left if it was a double-breasted suit when they did it to the right or something like that. And or you would have thought that that person still had dark hair when their hair was already graying, or you thought that you know, if you've ever gone back to a place where you lived as a kid and realized now it looks so small compared to how you remembered it as a kid, you know, right. It's like you thought it was like this huge place, but then you go back and visit it and it's this tiny little hut, you know, or something on that level.
But you don't need a photograph. You know, if you want to write about something and you don't have a photograph, you can just picture it in your head. You know, do a little meditation. You know, go back to that time and place in your head. It doesn't have to be a perfect memory. I think that's, you know, a big misconception, that it has to be perfect. It has to be, you know, detailed in the same exact way that it was. And it doesn't need to be. It just needs to get to the emotion that you felt there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anyone else have something that they, Betty, you had something you wanted to say?
The two of you just brought up something I wanted to comment on, right to that point of being able to tell the real truth. I think many of us growing up were so burdened with the need to always be honest that it's hard to shake that off. I've been afraid to lie even when it might have saved my life, you know? So I'm owning that now. Hey, this is my story, and my siblings, we love getting together and sometimes exploring what were common experiences and realizing how each of us from our place in the family saw it differently. So I tell the truth as best I can, but it helps sometimes to just say, well, you know, maybe her dress wasn't red, but I can make it that if I want to.
Or it should have been.
Yeah, exactly. If only she'd known, she should have.
And you can even say things like, you know, to the best of my knowledge, her dress was red. I mean, you can even say things like, to the best of my memory, this is what happened. To acknowledge that, you know, there may be some room there, but it's still, like you said, Betty, to the best of your memory and your truth and your story.
Anyone else have an approach maybe to how you might write something, a memoir, or tell your story, or one of your many stories?
Richard, I see you smiling. Do you want to share? Go ahead and unmute.
I think you're still muted, though. I think you're still muted. Why is he still muted?
Unmute if you can, Richard. Otherwise, you could drop something in the chat for us.
Right. I think he's trying to unmute, but it's not working. Down in the lower left hand. Oops, then we lost him all. Oh, there he coming back.
The joys of technology.
Yeah, he's on again, off again. In the lower left hand
Richard,
corner.
there you go,
Now
Richard.
you're on. There you go.
Yes, I'm on an iPad, which
Oh,
makes it, and I've got one of these typing style iPad enclosures for it, you know, not the right word, enclosure, I guess, but that makes it a little tougher. Yeah, I'm in about day 20 of what looks like recurrent COVID. And so I've been thinking about you know, being kind of shut in here in Vermilion. I'm kind of shut in and have more reflective thoughts. I just had a good friend die. Just learned of his death, which was well back in December, but I just learned of it this last couple of weeks. And this fellow was such a great storyteller. And I also, with the events in Ukraine, I've been thinking of a trip that I took to Chernobyl in the early 90s, right at the fall of the Soviet Union. And there's all of those memories have been kind of flooding back to me, and not really being a natural born storyteller, but some of these thoughts have been, you know, during my convalescence here, I've been thinking that I've been thinking back to those, and just this little exercise we've had in the last half hour has made me think more about trying to record that more permanently. Some of those thoughts, like of my trip to Chernobyl, and there's still the trip itself was centered around the effects on the health of especially the children of that area during that time. I'm a geologist, and there's aspects of the contamination that I had been familiar with in some earlier work. So I ended up with this trip sponsored by the UN to go and study those effects. And so that's kind of a story that's really percolated to the top for me in just the last few weeks.
can you, Richard, can you talk a little bit about how that story might impact us?
Well, I'm thinking of one of the things that during that trip that really impacted me was the notion that my gosh, you know, we end up with these feelings of we versus they between the United States and other adversaries over maybe the entire history of the country. But I was really struck by having the feeling of the humanity and the humanness and the lives that I was witnessing there. And it took a whole spectrum. You know, when I was in Moscow during the preparatory part of that trip, I was there for about a month and a half, and part of it was spent in Moscow. And going down to where we, the Westerners, impacted the lives of those that live in Moscow, I went by the brand new at that time, 3-story McDonald's. And what struck me most was how intense apparently the family unit was in those people, the folks that lived, not those people, but those folks that lived in that neighborhood of Moscow you would see something that'd be rare here. I would see someone that was obviously a mother with teenage boys, and they walked hand in hand in the sidewalks. How often would you see that in Vermillion? Even, and we're kind of a homey.
Detail. I love that detail. Those are the things that stick with you, right, Richard?
Yeah. Yes. And that was one. And then the other parts was that when I was in Minsk, it was the town that I worked out of when we were actually visiting the Chernobyl area, that places, there were buildings much like the dorms here at USD, that size of buildings and bigger, filled with kids that had thyroid disease from being exposed to the radiation, the radioactive strontium, actually, that gave them thyroid disease and cancers in the thyroid. And what a sad, incredible impact that accident had on thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of folks. And going through those hospitals was really a life-changing event for me.
Thank you, Richard, for sharing. How many think that Richard should write some of this down? Just, yes, absolutely. Those details need to be preserved, on paper.
Right.
Just some of those moments that you shared with us would be even a paragraph here or there. It doesn't have to be perfect writing either. Just get the words down, get the memories down. Yeah. Don't worry about how it's written, just write it.
Thank you.
I'd like to underscore that it is a lot of the details that you're talking about now, Richard, that when we get the news story, if it was there at all, we don't get that part. But when it's separated out as someone's memory, and they're talking about it from a different perspective as a geologist, then a lot of people who would never have even read the other news stories, they get a perspective. And sometimes from that, people start to want to put other people's bits and pieces of stories together and make a whole story. That's how history is mostly written, by people going and finding letters and documents and pictures and things like that. And they put that together and try to make it coherent. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but they try to make some kind of coherent narrative out of all of those bits and pieces. One of those pieces being left out changes the narrative. So that's why, your story and the things that you could bring to it, that perspective, so important.
And it's all in the detail. It's all in those rich details that are unique to Richard's story. That really makes us connect with it. And, we're going to remember things that he said throughout our day, throughout our week, because they were powerful details that he shared with us. And I always say, for every story in your life, you could really sum it up in one sentence. For instance, I married the love of my life. That might be the story that I'm talking about, but it's going to be so much more interesting if I show that wedding day and show that kiss and show, some of that love through my words, showing, the color of the dress and the people in the room and the smiles and, the exchange of rings. Those are all the details that make it a richer story. So every story could really be narrowed down to one sentence, but you want to bring out those details because that's what really connects with people.
And it could be the story there could be the love of my life married somebody else.
Yeah, there you go.
I was lucky she didn't.
Oh, good, Richard. I'm glad.
How it almost went awry.
Yes. Just remember, though, that the one-line story is never the story you want. You want to expand and include, the details that make it so special. And so, meaningful, and where is the moment of impact in that story? Make sure you show that as well.
There's probably, I can probably fit it in one sentence. My brother's puppies ate my bride's bouquet.
Oh, see, now we want all those details though. Now
That's
we
right.
want you to show us that story.
And why she didn't marry me after
Yeah.
that.
She did anyway.
Absolutely.
Oh, that's even more interesting. And still, she married me.
Yeah, still she married me. And the night before, we took a long walk in the country, and I had given her the out that time that this is a little different guy you're marrying here. If you have any second thoughts, let's think through it right now. And
Exactly.
even after the puppy incident, everything went well.
That's all good, man. It's all good. Great. Thank you so much, Richard. Anyone else have some kind of idea for a story, or where are you on that?
Well, we
Yeah, I
have
do.
some in the chat as well. So make sure, let's see. Joyce said, I have the opportunity to write a story about life imitating arts, imitating life, imitating art. A fourth grader from Illinois will be portraying me as I portray Sarah Campbell at a Wax Museum school event. I volunteered to write a magazine article for the National Association for Interpretation. They call Chautauqua First Person Interpretation. Mary Haig says, in my first memoir about living in South Korea, I organized the book around themes and used a Korean cultural artifact or ritual as an organizing tool for the chapter. In my recent memoir, I used a loose chronological structure. I think form is dictated by content. And yes, I never think about the final product, but focus on a specific event or person. Yeah, I think that's helpful, not to think about the final product, but just to dive in sometimes to the writing and to organize later. Thank you for sharing in the chat.
Yeah.
I like what she said about an artifact too. So sometimes an artifact from your life or a specific object, such as, an antique that was carried through generations in your family, that might inspire a story, to center your story around an object that was an heirloom, and maybe think about the different travels of the object through different generations, and maybe what the object saw through those different generations in your family. Or maybe the object saw, several different memories that you can recall. So centering your story around an object or an artifact can be a great way to organize a piece of writing.
Mm-hmm. And we should not forget things like smells, because smells have very strong connections to memory. And there are some times when a certain smell will just bring back a person. For example, whenever I smell WD-40, I always think of my father, because I think he used it for cologne, because he always smell like WD-40, And then there are also things like sounds, like some music has like certain connection with events or a person or something like that, that will bring back a story that is involved with that song.
Yes, really tuning into those five senses is going to make your writing so much better, and it's going to make it so much more fun for you as the writer to think about those smells or those sounds and see if you can bring them out in your writing. Like, what exactly did it smell like? And can you talk about that smell without saying it smelled like? Can you just say what the smell is without being cliche? Can you think of a new way to describe the smell or the sound? I think that's the challenge sometimes, but you as the unique person that you are, you can do it. You have a new perspective to share with us.
Mhm. Yeah. Jace, did you have any memories that
Well,
are stories you should? I know you have stories you can tell.
oh, I love stories, and I have different stories I am still sharing and working on. But I just wanted to share that my husband was a Vietnam veteran, so he used storytelling and his experiences to share what it felt like to be in Vietnam and to deal with all the, we've been talking about humor and really humorous things. Those are wonderful stories, but there are also traumatic ones that had to be, that he had to get out so that he could heal. And that's how he used stories, and how he was able to share a part of his life on videotape, which I have of him, and also through his stories. So now his sons and me and others can perhaps learn from those experiences. But for example, whenever he would smell, we would go past Burger King and he would smell the hamburgers frying. Sometimes he couldn't go by there because it just depended on the day. But he that reminded him of burning babies in Vietnam. And so, very, very traumatic kinds of things. And so we would go all the way around the other side of, around it, so we wouldn't smell those burning hamburgers. So that, that's a very visual kind of thing, and he, but so as you can share wonderful stories and wonderful experiences, you can also, they could be very cathartic for folks who are suffering from PTSD and other kinds of things. So I know it's kind of obvious, you use interviews and you use visual images and videography to tell a written story, but he literally, he didn't like to write down things, but he liked to talk about things. And many of us are native people, are auditory oral speakers, so that helps us to be able to get our story out that way, and then maybe transfer it on in a written form.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for the good ideas. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, some stories, they are harder to tell and to process. And sometimes people aren't ready yet to write or to tell a story. But sometimes when they decide that they are, and they're able to share it, it does become therapeutic to actually provide some closure to it, or make some meaning of it, of what happened, like we were talking about earlier. So sometimes that can be a therapeutic endeavor, just to get it down onto paper or to share it with someone else.
Mhm. I think Jace brought up a very important point that it's easy to overlook, and that is the importance of scars as a prompt, because we have a lot of different scars. Some of them are physical that we can see, but many of them are emotional, things, like the inability to like drive past a McDonald's. That's a kind of emotional scar. It points at that. And when we can recognize those scars, they can also be prompts for, even if we don't share that story with anyone else, but it can help us to organize in our own heads, well, what's happening with me? Why am I feeling that way? Because often by retelling that in a way that we can just sit with it, sometimes that helps us to find it's scar tissue, but it's no longer an open wound. We can just recognize, okay, that thing happened and that was a story behind that, but that's healed over now.
Absolutely. Completely agree with you, Lawrence. And I think it's important to realize we all have those scars. Nobody has this perfect, idealistic, idyllic life. Even if maybe your childhood seemed idyllic, like mine, I often say I feel like I had an idyllic childhood, but then when you really go back and think about it, some things weren't perfect. So we all have those scars, and it's okay to own those scars and to even explore what they are in your writing. And just realize that we're all in this life together, and we all have things that have happened to us that leave those scars. And it's okay. It's okay to be vulnerable, and it's okay to feel a certain way. When you think about some of those memories, it's okay to feel how you feel. And it's up to you to share only when you are ready.
Yeah, I'd just like to add the South Dakota Book Celebration, the annual event. I'm not sure the exact title, but they do a veterans workshop and actually a veterans writing contest. And I procrastinated the last several years, but I'm entering this year. And maybe Jace, her husband, or relatives, or Deborah, Debbie, the National Guard person, may want to join in that session too. I took a class out in Oregon through one of the presenters a few years ago, and it was wonderful. And get you all excited about writing again. And as a caregiver now, I'm 24/7, so I have some time where I can sit down in front of a computer and hammer out something. But I have something in mind, and I've really structured it over the last couple of years in my mind, and I'm going to get it on paper. Hopefully, they still have that section with the book celebration annually. So thank you.
Thanks, James.
Good. Well, we're coming up on the last few minutes of our time together today, and I want to open it up. Anybody have any last thoughts before we get ready to wrap up?
I'm
Or
not
any
sure if
questions?
I'm on or not. I have a question.
Go ahead, Sharon.
Well, I don't have a question. I have a comment.
Okay.
About the more recent things you were talking about. It reminded me of a story Robert Bly told a long time ago. There was a king who was very sensitive to his people's feelings. And one day this young man came in and he was so hurt by something, I forget what it was, and it was just destroying his life. And so the king said to him, I want you to come in every night, every evening to my court and tell your story. And so the young man did, because he was the king. He obeyed the king. So he came in every night, every evening, and he told his story, how hurt he was. And, after about a year of telling the story every evening, he had lost his sadness over it, and he was in control of it because he shared it.
Mm-hmm.
End of story.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that, Sharon. And I think it would not be a good thing if I didn't mention that one of the ways that people are dealing with people who have trauma now is to give them beta blockers, which are the things that keep your heart from sort of going off the rail and, those kind of things. The drug is really for that, but they give them beta blockers and then they have them tell the story of their trauma. And what it allows people to do is not have the body feed back the anxiety that was felt during the traumatic events, and then have people relive it through their bodies again. But they can relive it as an objective thing that, oh, this thing happened, as opposed to their body making them feel like they're back in the situation where they were in danger or inflamed or something like that. And that helps them to get over the emotional impact, though the story did not change. And I think that that is a thing that we that happens as we settle with ourselves and as we take the time and as we, as Sharon was pointing out, retell the story to the point that the body no longer thinks it has to be in fight or flight mode again when it hears that story. So that can be very useful as well. Now we're back at, it's actually after 10:30, and so we want to just thank you, Molly, for joining us today. This has been very instructive and very useful for me, and I'm certain for other folks as well.
Thank you, everyone. And no matter what, just start writing, even if it's only for you, even if you're writing only for yourself and you have no intention of sharing, just start writing.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot. We'll see you all next week, same time and the same station.
Thanks.